So we'll be, yeah. So good evening, everyone, and carrying forward this episode session on GI and hepatobiliary oncology. So as you all know, we have reached so far in primary liver cancers up to the systemic therapies. And today we'll be covering the role of systemic therapies, including the targeted TKIs, immunotherapies, and all, and their role in the advanced setting as well as in the bridge over settings. So we'll be starting the session. And starting the session, I welcome Dr. Senthil, I welcome Dr. Ankur, Dr. Sahaj. I think Dr. Pankaj Goyal has also joined. Welcome, Dr. Pankaj and Dr. Vikas. So I welcome you all. Yeah. So thank you for contributing your time to this academic session. And I invite Dr. Senthil, who is a senior medical oncologist in Indo-American Cancer and Research Institute, Hyderabad. Sir will be focusing on basically all of the overview and evidence-based management and role of systemic therapies in primary liver cancers. So, sir, I welcome you, and now you can take over the screen and share this.
Thank you so much, everybody at Max, Dr. Shefali in particular, for asking me to speak on this topic, which is systemic therapies in hepatocellular carcinoma, evidence-based management. So this is the timeline in terms of development of therapies for advanced hepatocellular carcinoma. We'll come to what advanced is in a moment. Till about 2007, we didn't have any therapies at all. In 2007, sorafenib got approved, and then there was a huge hiatus between 2007 and 17, a 10-year hiatus before we got the next therapy, which was again a VEGF TKI with a slightly wider, spectrum of activity, which is lenvatinib. And then starting 2018 and so on, we've got a slew of therapies in the first line and in the second line. Of course, like in any other anatomical subsite, immune checkpoint inhibitors making their way into the therapy armamentarium. So that's roughly what has happened in the past nearly 15 years in the landscape of therapy for hepatocellular carcinoma. Now, before we get started, Dr. Shefali did tell me that you've had your basics already, but just to refresh that a little bit, here you have the algorithm that most of us would follow in terms of approaching a patient with primary liver cancer. So this is the BCLC staging system, the Barcelona Clinic staging system. Now, like any other staging system, it's got its own set of pluses and minuses. We won't discuss that. The criteria that is used in order to put patients into one of these categories, A, B, C, and D, consist of performance status, the Child-Pugh score, and the extent of disease, which is classified based on whether there is a portal vein invasion or extrahepatic disease or not. A lot of what we will discuss today will be advanced disease, which means it's BCLC-C. Now, what is BCLC-C? BCLC-C is a patient who is symptomatic, performance status 1 or 2. You could be CPA or B, Child-Pugh's A or B, portal vein or extrahepatic disease. So this is what would be classified as BCLC-C, and the majority of therapies that I will talk to you about today apply to this group of patients. Of course, towards the end of my talk, I will talk a little bit about bridging and how the borders between all of these are actually starting to get blurred. And the reason for that blurring is because you have good systemic therapies with decent response rates, unlike what was the case in the past. Now, let's quickly run through many of these therapies and the data that is available in order to back up the use of these therapies. So as I said earlier, sorafenib was the first drug, or the TKI, which was randomized against placebo to show an improvement in the overall survival. Nothing phenomenal, 10.7 months, but it was certainly better than placebo, okay, which was 7.9 months. We had to wait 10 long years before we got the REFLEX study, which randomized patients to lenvatinib versus sorafenib. This was a non-inferiority study, and the result was that lenvatinib was non-inferior to sorafenib. So then if you compare and contrast lenvatinib and sorafenib, where does that take us to? As we said, the median overall survival, not very different, 13.6, 12.3. But interestingly, the progression-free survival was better for lenvatinib compared to sorafenib. Very important, clinically relevant, the overall response rate for lenvatinib was 24% compared to less than 10% for sorafenib. Now, in patients who had an AFP of more than 200, now this is an unplanned subset analysis, there was an overall survival benefit in terms of outcome for lenvatinib versus sorafenib. I'm not showing you the adverse event profile here, but for all of us who have used sorafenib and then moved on to lenvatinib, we would agree that lenvatinib is a much easier drug to handle. It's still difficult, but much easier compared to sorafenib. So that is the nitty-gritty of the REFLECT study. But having said that, the REFLECT study excluded certain sets of patients, which the SHARP study was the pivotal regulatory study for sorafenib, right? So the SHARP study included certain patients that the REFLECT study did not have. Now, these include patients with ECOG performance status 2, large volumes of disease in the liver, which is more than 50%, bile duct invasion, main portal vein invasion, and so on and so forth, all of which are associated with poorer prognosis. Now, these patients were not included in the REFLECT study. Maybe that's what is reflecting as a slightly better overall survival, around 13.5 months compared to just over 10 months that you got in the SHARP study. The other two important, extremely relevant points are that all the second-line agents that you have today were tested post-sorafenib, not post-lenvatinib. So if you're looking at level 1 evidence, there's nothing that exists post-lenvatinib and all the drugs that come after sorafenib. The other clinically relevant issue is that in patients who have had liver transplantation, there's absolutely or hardly any data for lenvatinib, while there's some data for sorafenib. That's a feasible option. So these are some of the points that one needs to keep in mind when you're choosing between lenvatinib and sorafenib. So do we really go into this before we choose patients lenvatinib versus sorafenib in the clinic? No. We use lenvatinib in patients who are fit, who are eligible to go on lenvatinib based on the indications and contraindications. We generally don't use the fact that these groups of patients were not included in the REFLECT study. So that is practice versus the evidence that is available in the literature. But I think where we have moved to is a little ahead of lenvatinib versus sorafenib. We have moved to the IM-BRAVE 150 study. What did this study do? It studied a combination of atezolizumab plus bevacizumab, a PD-L1 inhibitor plus a VEGF antibody, and randomized patients to this combination versus sorafenib in patients who had a CPA, okay? Patients who had CPA, and there were patients who had BCLC-C, and there was a small group of patients with BCLC-B also. The co-primary endpoints were progression-free survival and overall survival. It was a 2:1 randomization, 2 patients on atezo-bev versus 1 on sorafenib. Remember that those groups of patients who have poorer prognosis, which we went through in the previous slide, were included in this study, which is bile duct invasion, more than 50% liver involvement, and so on and so forth. What did the study show? The study showed that the overall survival for atezo-bev was much better than what you got with sorafenib. That's 19.2 months versus 13.5 months. The hazard ratio was 0.66. The progression-free survival also was in favor of the combination compared to sorafenib itself. So the co-primary endpoints of overall survival and progression-free survival were met. There seems to be a tail to the curve. There seems to be a tail to the curve here, but I think we need to wait for longer follow-up before we really say that there is a tail that is sustained. We still don't have that much of a follow-up to say that the tail is there at this point in time. But I think what is interesting is this data that was read out at the AACR meeting this year. And there is some data not only in HCC now with atezo, there is some data in lung cancer also that about a third of patients who go on atezolizumab actually develop anti-drug antibodies. Okay. Now, we know that monoclonal antibodies tend to stimulate our immune system to produce anti-drug antibodies, but to majority of the antibodies that we use in clinical practice, it's a minuscule percentage of patients who will develop an anti-drug antibody. But in atezolizumab, you see that about a third of patients actually develop anti-drug antibody. And look at the hazard ratio for overall survival for these 30% patients. It's actually 0.96, which is negative. If you didn't develop an anti-drug antibody, then your overall survival was actually better compared to the full cohort of patients. Remember, 0.66 for the intent to treat versus 0.55 for patients who do not develop an anti-drug antibody. Is it commercially available? I mean, the assay to look at whether anti-drug antibodies are there or not. The answer is no at this point in time. We don't know when it is likely to hit the market, if at all it will. There's no way of predicting which is this patient who is going to develop the anti-drug antibody, but this is just some food for thought. There's no applicability to clinical practice as of now, except for us to know that this can happen in about a third of all patients who you treat with the IM-Brave combination. Leaving that aside, something that we need to cheer about is the response rate, right? So we said the response rate for sorafenib was around 9.2%, which went up to nearly 24% for patients who went on lenvatinib in the better prognosis group. But here you have nearly a 35% response rate for the combination, which is again very significant. Now it's significant from getting your patient to a better outcome in the advanced disease, palliating symptoms better. But I think something that we will see more often in the future is getting this combination in the form of some bridging therapies. Now, earlier, when you look at patients who had loco-regional therapies, patients were randomized to loco-regional therapy versus sorafenib, which hardly had any response rate. And then everybody declared that loco-regional therapies were better. But now your real competitor here is likely to be atezo-bev, because there you get responses which are nearly as good as what you would get with loco-regional therapies. You could use a combination of the two, one after the other, which I'm sure we will have some chance to discuss in the panel today. So this is again something that one needs to keep in mind. So that's about the IM-Brave study and the new data regarding anti-drug antibodies in this clinical setting. What about single agent immune checkpoint inhibitors in the first line? That's what the CheckMate 459 study looked at, nivolumab versus sorafenib. Unfortunately, the trial was negative. But I would say this is a statistically negative study, but a clinically relevant study. Why am I saying it's clinically relevant? Two important reasons. One is that there is some overall response rate which is better for nivolumab compared to sorafenib. There seems to be some tail to the curve that is getting on at the end of 3 years. And so if you have somebody who is not a candidate for anti-VEGF therapy because of a contraindication, though this is not FDA approved, there is some data for you to use single agent immune checkpoint inhibitor in this particular clinical setting. The other group of patients where we always get into trouble with is Child-Pugh B. And I have to say that a significant proportion of our patients in clinical practice fall into this category, and there is no high-level, robust data to say what should be done in this group of patients. We always use, I sometimes use the IM-Brave combination in patients with Child-Pugh B. There's no data, we all know that, but we can't say, I don't want to treat you because you're in Child-Pugh B. There is some data with sorafenib based on the Gideon study. What was the Gideon study? The Gideon study is a post-marketing study, a retrospective analysis of patients in the community on sorafenib. There were some patients, I think about 70 patients with Child-Pugh B. The overall survival for sorafenib in Child-Pugh B is about 5.7 months, which is not very different from not giving these patients any treatment at all. So if you ask me, where is the data? It's sorafenib. But is that data really great? The answer is no. What about immune checkpoint inhibitors in this group of patients? there is some data with immune checkpoint inhibitors. That's the Child-Pugh B7-B8 cohort of what you call as the Checkmate 4.0 study. Now, the results are summarized in this table here. Again, overall response rate not very different from sorafenib. That's 7%. Here you've got 10%. But if you are in that 10%, your duration response is not too bad. The median overall survival is numerically better compared to sorafenib. 9.8 for sorafenib naive, 7.3 for sorafenib treated. So it depends upon how you want to interpret and use this in your day-to-day practice. But the point is that you don't have to send your patients with B7-8 on sorafenib only, or you don't want to send them home. There is something to fall back upon, which is immune checkpoint inhibitor. Again, there we can discuss whether IMbrave is something that we should use in this combination. I would debate saying yes, but there isn't any data to support that recommendation as such. What about the upcoming trials in this group of patients? I think there are a lot of exciting trials. We'll get a lot of these results end of this year and till up to 2023. This will probably give us better insights about whether you should be using a TKI plus an immune checkpoint inhibitor or an antibody plus an immune checkpoint inhibitor. We will eagerly await the results of these studies. So that much about first-line therapy. What about second-line therapies? Again, as I said earlier, all the second-line studies, the TKIs have been after sorafenib. None is after lenvatinib or the IMbrave combination. Regorafenib, cabozantinib, and ramucirumab are three drugs that you have in this space to use for your patients in the second line. I will not go into the details of these studies for want of time. What about immune checkpoint inhibitors in the second line? They have been a little disappointing because the randomized study with nivolumab, as I said, was negative. The Pembro study, again, the randomized Pembro study was negative. It did not meet its primary endpoint. But if you just look at the phase 2 studies, you get a response rate of anywhere between 15 to 20%. The response is durable in those who get that response. The overall survival is 12 months, which is not very different from what you get with the second line TKIs or ramucirumab in that clinical setting. Is there data for combination checkpoint inhibitors in the second line? The answer is yes. There is data with Nivo and Ipi in various dose combinations. But the winner, at least based on this phase 1-2 trial, seems to be Nivo 1 milligram per kg and Ipi 3 milligrams per kg. That is given for 4 doses, and then you just continue nivolumab. The overall survival seems to be quite impressive at 22 months for this group of patients. Remember, with single agent immune checkpoint inhibitor, you get roughly around a year. This is nearly 2 years, but you have to be cautious in interpreting this data. This is phase 1-2 data. We will wait for some phase 3 data to come up before we say that this is a great combination to use, but there may be selective group of patients where you may want to use it. We'll look at it very soon. Durva plus tremelimumab, again, combination immune checkpoint inhibitors, very impressive, 18.7, not very far off from your Ipi-Nivo data in that clinical setting. So there is some data with dual immune checkpoint inhibitors, at least in the second line. But remember that this also comes up with a significant proportion of patients having toxicity, right? Both in terms of their physical toxicities, autoimmune toxicities, and of course, financial toxicities. So what are the clinically relevant questions in the second line? Would I consider an immune checkpoint inhibitor in the second line for advanced? Yes, especially if your duration of response or in the first line therapy to a TKI is very short, or if your patient is intolerant. Now, would you use an immune checkpoint inhibitor after an IMbrave? I do not think we should be doing that, at least at this point in time, because there's absolutely no data there. Would you use single or dual immune checkpoint inhibitor? I think if you're looking at a patient who's young, who's willing to take those side effects, and in whom you need responses, because as I showed you, the response rate for dual immune checkpoint inhibitor is somewhere around 30%, which is much higher compared to the 15 to 20% that you get with the single agent therapy. and also significantly higher, nearly 3 times higher compared to what you get with the TKIs. What about immune checkpoint inhibitor in B7, B8? I said earlier, checkmate 40, nivolumab may be used cautiously in this group. So to summarize, here are two approaches. The standard approach or the preferred sequence would be an I am brave to begin with. Once you finish that, there's no evidence as to what you should be doing in the second line. It's an open field, lenvatinib or sorafenib. And then after that, it's cabo, regorafenib, or ramucirumab. And then if you already use the immune checkpoint inhibitor, there's almost absolutely no data for reusing an immune checkpoint inhibitor. Is there a role for dual immune checkpoint inhibitor later during the course? We don't know is the answer. An alternate sequence is lenvatinib, sorafenib. There's no good reason really not to use atezo-bev if your patient can afford it and is fit for atezo-bev. But in case you have used it, you start with len or sorafenib, and then you probably would go to atezo-bev in the second line. As I said earlier, the third line option at the discretion of the clinician and after discussion with the patient. But I think the principles are that you should make sure that your objective of treating that patient should be absolutely clear. You should optimize survival and, most importantly, quality of life. Clinical trials are not something that most of our centers are running at this point in time, at least for HCC. Make sure, like in any other clinical, anatomical subsite, make sure that your patient is exposed to as many therapies as possible and keeping in mind quality of life at the same time, because that's what is likely to lead to better outcomes. My penultimate slide, something that's very important. This is where the field is moving. As I said, the border between BCLC B and C is started to blur because you've got some bridge therapies. Now you could start with immune checkpoint inhibitor plus an anti-VEGF therapy and end up with surgery. You might start with TACE-TARE and end up with surgery. You might combine TACE-TARE and end up with some combination systemic therapy. These are all strategies where there isn't high quality of evidence to support at this point in time, but all of us in our practice have had those handfuls of patients where we've employed some strategies like this. So here is the future. These are going to blur, and you may go from one therapy and jump to the other depending upon what the clinical situation is and what you're trying to achieve at the end of the day. A slew of clinical trials that are running in all these clinical settings: adjuvant therapy, combination therapy with loco-regional therapy. What are my take-home messages for today? The basics are always there. Make sure you start with the Child-Pugh and your BCLC, because that's based on which most of our treatment decisions today are made. Atezo-bev is here to stay as the first-line standard systemic therapy as long as there is no contraindication to use of these drugs. There are some competitors which are coming up, but we don't have first-line evidence as of now. As we get them, we will stay with atezo-bev for now. For patients with Child-Pugh B data, selectively, you probably should be thinking of nivolumab or sorafenib. As I said, you could go a step further. There's no data, but it's not a contraindication to use an I am brave kind of a combination. I'll be happy to hear others' view on this. Multiple systemic therapy options are available for the second line and beyond, some with high quality evidence, some with lower quality evidence. I think this is an open field. It depends upon what you want to use, depending upon the first line therapy and what your patient wants and can afford. I think combinations are the future, which is ICPI plus TKI, ICPI plus ICPI, or loco-regional plus systemic therapy. And that's how I think ultimately we will move the field ahead and give our patients better quality of life and, more importantly, overall survival. Thank you so much. And I hand it over back to the organizers for questions, if any, and then Ankur's panel.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for a very nice and crisp presentation. There are few questions for you. So first question from Dr. Suhail Qureshi is, after how much time or exposure should one suspect or test for adverse drug events, so ADAs? So sorry, antibodies, which you mentioned.
I don't think we have a time that is established as of now, Dr. Suhail. So in the study that I'm quoting, they did it at 3 months and 6 months. That's when they look for anti-drug antibodies, but we really don't know what is the appropriate time to look for it. Any biomarkers to suspect the same? As I said earlier, there are no biomarkers at this point in time to say that this is a patient who is going to develop the anti-drug antibody. Dr. Roshni has asked, should patients who get TACE be allowed to continue sorafenib? There's no data for that as of now, Dr. Roshni. But as I said, on an individual patient basis, these decisions have to be made depending upon whether that patient is benefiting, tolerating sorafenib. You have to be very careful because unwarranted combinations can actually cause deteriorations in liver functions rather than help patients. So we have to be very careful in those settings.
Yeah. So one question from my side also, sir. So in post-transplant failure, once there is a recurrence or metastatic disease, so drug of choice or how to proceed? Does immune checkpoint inhibitor has a role in such scenario?
No, I think liver transplantation would be a contraindication to the use of immune checkpoint inhibitors. So we would not look at that as an option. But the field is open in terms of which TKI you want to use. And then the anti-VEGF antibody also in the second line if you have a patient who's got an AFP that's more than 400. But our experience in that setting is very little, and it's been disappointing, the least to say.
Right. Thank you, sir. So now I invite Dr. Ankur to carry forward the panel discussion. And the panelists would be Dr. Senthil sir, Dr. Sahaj, Dr. Pankaj Goel, and Dr. Vikas. So Dr. Ankur, I welcome you for starting your panel discussion.
What a friendly panel we have.
Dr. Ankur, thoda sa voice break hai. Can you adjust the network area if you can?
Long time personally. So
Dr. Ankur, thoda sa network issues hai. Shayad voice is not clear. Voice is not clear.
Now, am I clear
it's
now?
better. Yeah. It's better. It's better. Yes. Yeah.
So much, Shefali, for giving this opportunity, and very happy to share this panel and this moderate this session with Dr. Senthil Rajappa, Dr. Vikas Talreja, Dr. Sahaj, and Dr. Pankaj Goel. So, as Dr. Senthil rightly said that the stages said we used to have 12 years back multiple options where we have to choose this option in the right way, in the right manner. And but every scenario, every hospital is a different setting. It all depends upon the good hepatologist you have, a good gastroenterologist you have, what is the transplant program going on, and how do you actually predict these hepatocellular cancers, and what is to choose from. We're discussing decoding in hepatocellular cancer. So what is to decode? We have the drugs, we have plethora of drugs. So how to decode and how to choose that first line, second line, and beyond therapy. So we'll be discussing these minute details today. So my first question to Dr. Sahaj from PG. He belongs to a very big.
Dr. Ankur, your screen is also not moving. Your screen is also not moving. We can see your home page, but your screen is not moving. You are sharing your screen or not?
So can you see that?
No, we can see only the home page. So that is desktop downloads and all.
Just a minute.
Yeah.
I think there's a problem.
Ankur, you should unshare and share again.
Yeah,
Yes.
you can try that.
Let's stop sharing. Is it visible now?
The same thing. It's stuck up
No,
there.
Dr. Ankur. Can you just mail us the presentation? if it's not working.
Maybe you can ask the questions telling the PPT findings, because it'll take too
Yeah,
lot of
by
time.
that time, yes. By that time, you can start your discussion, and by the time you email it to Dr. Nikhil. Yeah, I think some network issues. He just got disconnected. Probably he'll be joining in a while. So in the meantime, if somebody wants to ask a question, he or she is most welcome. Please raise your hand or put your questions in the chat box. Yeah, Dr. Anku joined. Yeah.
Audible now?
Yes,
Hanji,
Anku.
Hanji, you are audible.
There's a problem in my computer, I think. So Dr. Sahej, I will just like to ask you, who manages the show in hepatocellular carcinoma at PGI Institute? So how do you manage? There are busy clinics, even our medical oncology, our hepatology, our gastroenterology is a busy clinic. How do you manage these shows? Who manages, who takes the lead in hepatocellular cancer? That is very important actually to understand. So these childhood staging, the BCLC staging, and the liver function test, and the bleeder, and the esophageal varicose, and some hepatorenal component. So who actually takes the show? It's very difficult for a medical oncologist and a pure hepatologist to manage this metastatic hepatocellular cancers. Dr. Sahej.
So sir, you're absolutely right. These are very difficult patients because in addition to a cancer, they also have another disease that is probably as bad as a disseminated malignancy. You know, decompensated cirrhosis per se has a median survival of about 2 years, which is less than many cancers. So yes, it's a difficult disease to manage, and the treatment is always multidisciplinary. It always has to be multidisciplinary depending upon the stage of the. So I guess in our institution, it is the hepatologist who is the first point of contact and the main care provider. We do the initial assessment. Unfortunately, we don't have a liver tumor rounds that are there in many big institutions, but we have our own internal departmental policies that we go by. And if the patient is, say, non-cirrhotic or very early cirrhosis, very small tumor and resectable, then we send him to the surgeons. Of course, this happens very infrequently. I can remember only 1 or 2 cases that in this institution that I've seen that have actually gone ahead for that. Most of the patients who we diagnose early on, they are they go for local regional therapy to the radiology department, whether RFA or TACE or TARE. And again, when it comes to systemic therapy, it is the patient remains with us if we are planning to give TKIs, or even from time to time we have given nivolumab, but then that is a very rare thing for an institution like PGI, where most of the patients who present are, economically not so well off. So that's a very rare thing to happen.
Dr. Sahej, can you hear me
Yes.
out?
Yes, I can.
How often when your chronic liver disease patients are on surveillance with an alpha protein and an ultrasound scan, how often actually do you identify these metastatic disease? So when you're doing surveillance, AFP is high, and when you investigate them further with the CT scan, bone scan, and you find a metastatic disease.
So now there are 2 things. One is surveillance and one is diagnosis of metastatic disease. Now, surveillance, we have a protocol for surveillance of every 6 months we do ultrasound and alpha fetoprotein. The surveillance, whether it is justified or not, whether it is cost effective or not, that's a matter of another debate altogether. But that is our departmental protocol. Usually, when we are surveilling patients, we do not see metastatic disease. Metastatic disease is usually seen in patients who present at outset, or if they have lost their follow-up for a while. So, I mean, if you ask me how many patients are found to be metastatic on surveillance, when they are already on surveillance, it's extremely uncommon. But at the outset, when we have a protocol of doing a CT scan at the time of diagnosis, especially if the patient is over 40 years old. This is a departmental policy. This is not an evidence-based policy. But yes, we find most of our HCCs, especially in the CHC, when we were treating with a large number of patients with DAS, we have found a lot of early cancers and the whole spectrum at the first diagnosis.
Dr. Vikas, can you hear me out? So I have a problem in internet connection. Dr. Vikas, can you hear me? Yes. So Dr. Vikas,
Yes, sir. You are audible, sir. Yes.
So when a diagnosis of hepatocellular carcinoma or a suspicion of hepatocellular carcinoma comes to your clinic, so when do you actually insist for a biopsy? So we always have a chronic liver disease settings with raised alpha fetoprotein or not raised alpha fetoprotein with a characteristic venous washout and arterial and venous phase washout, and you have those systemic disease or a locally advanced unresectable or a lymph nodal disease. When do you actually biopsy, Dr. Vikas? What are those conditions where you will biopsy these patients?
Very important question, and I must say that I find it very common because there is a misconception in probably whole of the northern India with many of the patients do have an apprehension of getting a biopsy done. So whenever there is a discordance between a radiological, serological, and clinical distinction, as if it is not matching the clinical findings, the radiological classical HCC phase, and also the alpha fetoprotein is not raised, then I usually ask and counsel them to get a biopsy done. It is very imperative that right now we don't have much offering in terms of the IHC and as well as the genetic profile has to be done. So probably if the three match together, I don't usually do a biopsy and start my clinical decision based on the Child-Pugh score and other general profile of the patient.
So I think we'll again throw this question to Dr. Sahej, and then Dr. Senthil can throw some light on it. Actually, biopsy when you have a differential diagnosis of a intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma with HCC, when you have a fibrolamellar variant, when your alpha fetoprotein is not raised, when you have a discordant between this radiological findings and alpha fetoprotein. So when actually in your clinic you do a biopsy to further proceed or confirm metastatic HCC in a CLD or a non-CLD patient?
I think Dr. Senthil can go first. And
Okay.
follow.
Okay. So I think I agree very much with what Vikas has said. So whenever there is a discordance between your tumor markers, so the first thing is one does not need to have an elevated alpha fetoprotein in order to make a diagnosis of HCC. I think, earlier when I was reading, or I continue to read, of course, when I meant I was reading, I'm talking about my DM days or early practice days. You needed to have an alpha fetoprotein that was more than 500 nanograms per mil, and then you needed to demonstrate, radiology with two modalities. So that's how you were used to making a diagnosis of HCC. I think we moved forward. You first don't need to have an elevated alpha fetoprotein to make a diagnosis. I think the radiology is paramount. If you've got the characteristic arterial enhancement and venous washout, I think that's good enough, especially if you have a patient with, in the background of chronic liver disease. But if you have somebody who's got a grossly elevated, if the radiology is not typical, that's one. If you've got somebody who's got a grossly elevated CA19-9 or a CA, if you did it, those are situations probably where I would err on the side of doing a biopsy. Again, in the absence of chronic liver disease and, atypical findings on the radiology with or without elevated markers, that's another situation where I would certainly go in and do a biopsy. But in the majority today, with the background of chronic liver disease, we would not do a biopsy.
So Dr. Sahej, final thing.
So I will agree with Dr. Senthil. He is absolutely right that AFP would not be a criteria for me either. In fact, biopsies for HCC are extremely rare in clinical context. Sometimes we do it as a part of a research project. However, we do them from time to time. And I would probably just build upon what Dr. Rajappa just said, that So when we see tumors that are not typically, so HCC is unique in the form that it takes up its supply from the hepatic artery, so it gives that characteristic, arterial enhancement, and by the time the venous phase takes up, the rest of the liver lights up, and by the time the HCC has washed up. So when we have this typical appearance, it's more or less clear that this patient has HCC. However, if it is a hypovascular lesion, if it is a small lesion with a high AFP, if it's a less than 1 centimeter lesion and the AFP is like say 25, 30, and we are still suspicious, and we for some reason cannot do a contrast enhanced ultrasound, or that is not available, in that case we may choose to do an FNA or an FNB. Or in case there is subtle changes in the imaging, like we see a slight capsular retraction, we see some biliary changes or CA99 elevated, those are the cases where I would want to do a biopsy. Another situation is when there is a vague infiltrating kind of appearance with the right clinical context, especially in NASH-related cirrhosis. Those are cases where we may, and associated with an indeterminate lesion, of course. Those are cases where we may choose to go in and take a needle in.
So are there instances where you have seen a complex intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma and a multifocal HCC, or a mixed type of pathology?
Absolutely. Collagen tumors are not uncommon. Now that we know how to recognize them, we are recognizing them more and more. I mean, probably this entity was very poorly defined initially, but as we understand more and more about it, now HCC and cholangiocarcinoma are basically on a spectrum of differentiation of the progenitor cells on the hepatocytic lineage or the cholangiocytic lineage. Now, sometimes the collisions do happen, collision tumors do happen, and yes, it is not uncommon. It's still not common, but it is not exactly rare nowadays. We do see them from time to time.
Yeah. So, Dr. Sahej, if we read about those IO papers and we read about those checkmate and keynote studies, and even in the I am brave subset analysis, we talk about the predictors to response even in the pathology of the previous hepatectomy and the previous transplant patients. So Dr. Senthil, you must be aware, and other panelists must be aware. So now we have the subsites of these hepatocellular carcinoma. We call it them lymphocytic rich, fibrolaminar variant, beta-catenin variant. So these IOs, so beta-catenin negative IOs are responding more, and beta-catenin positive. So there are some histopathological specialties and the predictors, and particularly in the IO era, where these catenin positive, negative, lymphocyte rich, lymphocyte depleted. So these are the hepatocellular biopsies. I think ILBS and PGI must be doing something on this way. The research must be going on this way. The paper actually tells these that what are the poor prognostic pathological parameters which will respond to IO or not. Any light which you can throw, Dr. Senthil and Dr. Sahej. Further, I proceed to first line and second line therapies.
Ankur, it's a very relevant point, but I would say that these are all post hoc analysis, unplanned subset analysis on biopsies which were evaluable for all of these studies. So though it's very important to be aware of these things, there are two important issues. One is that at this point in time, we don't think that these should be determining factors when you choose your treatment in the first line. Though the patients who, at least based on this analysis, are not expected to do well, there are still patients in that group who will respond and may do well. So it is, these are pointers to the way trials should be done in the future in terms of stratification and so on and so forth. It's clinically relevant, but not something that you would use at this point in time to decide on what you want to use.
Yes, so very well said. And these are pointers towards futurist direction of these IO further. But at this point of time, we do not have these predictions as such in our clinical setting. So Dr. Pankaj Goyal, so Dr. Pankaj and Dr. Vikas, the young medical oncologist, we must have seen those sorafenib eras and lenvatinib eras which are coming, the generic lenvatinib which have made our life easy. So Dr. Pankaj, Monday morning, how are you choosing the first line treatment? So what are the basic things which our listeners should understand? How do you choose first line therapy when you have a plethora of agents. So NCCN and all the guidelines suggest that sorafenib, lenvatinib, and atezo-bev combination are the category 1 recommendation in first line setting. So how do you choose this therapy out if you have to, Dr. Pankaj?
So actually, most of the patients what we receive, they have already received TACE, TARE, or some RFA when they were localized. So whatever we receive, they are already advanced and fit enough for the systemic therapies, and most of them have associated the local therapies if they are eligible in the past. And till date, I have not used any patient, not put any patient on atezo plus bev. Most of the patients what I have received in past maybe a year, most of the patients have been on TK in first line. Hardly any patient on these PD-L1 inhibitors. So previously I used to, there was only one drug, sorafenib. Whatever it is, left, right, and center, it used to be sorafenib. But after this advent of lenvatinib, when we know that the tolerance is better, we have started using lenvatinib, and especially so before starting the therapy, we have to see the Child-Pugh class, whether the patient is eligible for treatment or not. Just because patient is advanced, we should not blindly start the treatment. Practically speaking, though the recommendations are for class A, but then because of the good tolerance of these drugs, especially so lenvatinib, we tend to use even in class B practically, though the recommendations are class A. In fact, I have personally have patients who are having a controlled SCC, but terminal event is going to be the decompensation of the liver. So the disease is under control, but the underlying cirrhosis is leading to the terminal thing. So the gastroenterologist has to be in hand. So more than us, we will be just starting the treatment. Rest of the treatment, the supportive care has to be taken over by the gastroenterologist. So a good gastroenterologist is the key when you want a good outcome of SCC, because the patient will be having a lot of complications, will be having ascites, will be having sometimes the bleed. So that has to be taken care of. So first line, I preferably go for lenvatinib. And now, but now if patient can afford, then as Dr. Senthil has summarized everything, atezo plus bev happens to be the first line because no other drug is giving a survival of say around 20 months. Over and above, the PFS is also definitely much better, from 4.3 to 6.9 months. So sorafenib, the PFS was hardly anything. When you, as per text, 3 to 4 months of PFS, that was hardly anything. So preferably atezo plus bev. Practically, not many patients can afford that. So most of the patients will go for lenvatinib.
So I think very, very honestly, Pankaj has said that the kind of patients which come to the clinic. So in Indian setting, we rarely see a Child-Pugh egg, but the papers have also divided B into an early B and a late B. So the B7 to B8 and then the later B. So we in our clinic usually get B patients, and so none of the except from sorafenib and in very few cases nivolumab has been recommended in Child-Pugh B staging in advanced metastatic hepatocellular carcinoma. But majority of us, our patients are landing into Child-Pugh B. So Dr. Senthil, so when you have been using sorafenib, so what were those complications and what were those inhibitions where sorafenib was not being used in a full dosages, which was 400 milligram BD? We had a habit of using 200 BD, 400, 200. So how many of your patients were actually completing those 400 BD? Because this is very important. So majority of the second line trials, the resource trial, the cabozantinib and the ramucirumab study, they included those patients. You rightly said none of the studies actually compared with lenvatinib, the drug which we are using most often. They compared all these studies with sorafenib, and those patients who were sorafenib excluded, they could not tolerate that sorafenib were also included in that resource study. So what were those basic problems which you encountered in your practice 10 years back, which you are not, and the lenvatinib is that non-inferior drug giving that comfort to us in this first line, Dr. Senthil?
So Ankur, I have to confess that not a single patient reached 800. Okay, this is not in various indications that sorafenib has. So I just hate that drug if you ask me in one line. So in fact, I have told many or majority of my HCC patients who are, PS2, sometimes on a wheelchair, the kind of patients that you've been talking about and what Pankaj has been saying, I have almost always told them in the sorafenib only era that you should not be treated, and I have I cannot remember a patient who went beyond 400.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's what my practice has been. But lenvatinib has made life a little easier. I would, I don't want the listeners to go away with the impression that lenvatinib is, like water, is multivitamin, right? So lenvatinib comes with its own set of problems. But I think the HCC dose of 8 versus 12 milligrams, is reasonably better tolerated compared to sorafenib. But you have to be careful with lenvatinib also in your patients.
Yes,
So that's
rightly said. Rightly said. We have to be. It's not a multivitamin or a placebo or a water drug. So because so how do you monitor these patients of lenvatinib? It's an easy drug. The dosage is depending upon the weight of the patient and the liver function test. So because how do you monitor such patients, and what actually you tell them what to as compared to sorafenib? What all you do in your practice when you are prescribing lenvatinib, particularly these CLD patients who are Child-Pugh A, or even we are giving this drug in Child-Pugh B. Vikas, are you there?
Yes, sir. So usually, if there is already hepatic dysfunction, I usually don't start lenvatinib very easily, because it's known to cause derangement in the LFTs, and they tend to go towards the PS3 and tend to decompensate very easily. So those who are well compensated with a normal liver function test, I usually start lenvatinib, and do tend to monitor them every 15 days with the liver function test. Ask them to take a monitoring of self-charting of the BP daily. It is known to cause bleeding diathesis, which I'm very afraid, and I have seen torrential bleedings also with this drug also. But then most of them time it is usually well handled in terms of if the hepatic dysfunctions, the thrombocytopenia and the bleeding is being closely monitored with, and the patient usually comes at the first sight of these events with each. With sorafenib, the problem was diarrhea and the HFS, which was very, very sometimes very difficult to handle. With the lenvatinib, I haven't seen that diarrhea and that HFS a lot, but yes, BPs tend to shoot a lot. Bleeding tend to occur, especially the nasal bleeding, epistaxis tend to occur a lot. And definitely the hepatic dysfunctions is quite common in a quarter of patients.
So Dr. Sen very, very rightly said. So lenvatinib, we have to monitor the blood pressure, and we have to see the diarrhea which would happen, and the liver dysfunction. So Dr. Senthil, so coming on to the atezo and bevacizumab combination. So many of these chronic liver disease are not so friendly to bevacizumab. They have that esophageal varices, some ligation, some bleeding. They have some angiodysplasia, the watermelon stomach. So when it comes to Child-Pugh A, and we know the HCC is going the renal cell RCC way, the biology, the inflamed phenotype, and the choices of the combination. We're talking about IO plus VEGF or IO plus TKI. So if the patient has contraindication to bevacizumab, and do you have anything else in mind when it comes to combination in first line? Patient has money, patient has good liver function, and he has Senthil Rajappa, who has got all the experience. So what combination can you think apart from bevacizumab if it comes to combining this IO or TKI? Anything which comes in literature and comes into your mind?
So there have been instances, very rare. So first of all, as Pankaj clearly said, we all have, at least I have only a handful of patients. When I'm talking about handful, it's less than that, right? So of patients with the IM-Brave combination, but there have been, of that handful, there have been a couple of patients who have gone on the TKI plus, TKI plus atezo rather than putting them on Bev plus atezo. And the reason has been sometimes, if it's the usual impression that all of us have that atezo plus Bev might take a little longer for that response to kick in. So if you want a slightly earlier response because your patient has got a larger tumor burden but is well preserved, good liver function, no other contraindications to the use of an anti-VEGF therapy, then I have used TKI in that instance. But in the majority of those handfuls, it's been the combination of anti-VEGF plus anti-VEGF antibody I'm talking about, plus atezolizumab. Of course, as you rightly pointed out, all of them should compulsorily have an OGD done. Make sure that if there is a potential for that esophageal varice to bleed, whatever has to be done for that should be done. There is no specific guideline on what, if you have grade 3 or grade 4 or grade 2, what should be done. It's left to the wisdom of the treating gastroenterologist to decide what that varus actually warrants. So there is no standard guideline on that, but the most important thing is that you don't want to start something without looking into your patient's tummy and then ending up having a torrential bleed.
The pitfall of IMBRAVE study was that only 25% of these whole cohort were having esophageal varices. So it was
Correct.
very choosy patients. So
Correct.
I was talking about that AACR study, the ASCO study, and the ESMO paper publication of the fast track approval of Keytruda, pembrolizumab plus lenvatinib combination. I wish I could have shown that waterfall curve. The 80% of those patients, they were small studies, 30 to 35, but this pembro and lenvatinib combination had given a response rate of even more than 70% when these Child-Pugh A were being used. So anybody who has used this combination, I have used in this 3 or 4 patients, a predictable response, because you are using a TKI and you are using a Keytruda combination, which the response rates are pretty much higher as we compare to the 30% IMBRAVE.
Correct,
patient.
correct, Ankur. That's what when I said that I'm using an ICPI with the TKI, that's what I meant. I meant lenvatinib and pembrolizumab.
Yes. So
can I make a couple of comments here, if that's okay?
please, yes, please.
Yeah. My apologies before I start, because this is a predominantly oncology group, and I am going to give a hepatologist perspective here. Now, liver disease is not separated from HCC. Liver disease is an integral part of HCC, and whether the patient suffers to their end result because of HCC or the cirrhosis and its complications, it is immaterial. What matters is, can we prolong survival in a meaningful way? Now, if we look at the guidelines, they say that if we can prolong survival, meaningful survival, by 3 months, that is a threshold for efficacy of treatment in advanced HCC. Now, if we look at the data, very granularly, even in the SHARP trial, the original trial which established the efficacy of sorafenib, it was 2.8 months. Again, I am not nitpicking here. Yes, it is close to where it could have been, but you have to remember that in the SHARP trial, the total duration of survival was 10.7 months, the median overall survival. If you look at the real world experience, most of the larger studies, including thousands of patients from Taiwan, from USA, from UK, Canada, all having more than 500,000 patients, the median survivals have been much lower than that. So any prolongation of survival, expecting it to be more than 3 months, is slightly a stretch. And interestingly, building upon what was just discussed, most of these trials have been extremely picky. Even their control arms have had survival of 13 months, which is not something we see in these patients. These are very, very carefully selected patients who are very, very, very selected patients who are otherwise going to do very well. So to translate all the trial data into clinical context, into clinical perspectives, is not as rosy. If we look at the Gideon registry, which Dr. Rajappa talked about, in Child-Pugh B status, which had about 1,000 patients, if I'm not mistaken, 600, 700 patients, the median survival was 5.2 months. So with sorafenib in the Gideon registry, which was a very careful registry, where the child A survival was 13.6 months, child B survival was 5.2 months. So while we want to give them treatment, what are we achieving out of it? So we need to be very cognizant of this. This is the only thing that I want to sensitize about. We need to be very cognizant of exactly how much benefit we are able to provide.
Very right.
Can I make a point, Ankur?
Sure.
Yes. So that what Dr. Sahej is saying is exactly what I echoed. When I was doing my talk in terms of the Gideon registry. If you look at the placebo arm in the SHARP study, the outcome was better for the placebo arm in patients with Child-Pugh A compared to what you get with sorafenib in Child-Pugh B in the Gideon study. So you can imagine that it's not going to be any better than placebo. So, you have to really think twice before you really, want to put somebody with Child-Pugh B, unless, as Pankaj clearly said, absolutely fit, walked in but poor liver function, that's not a combination that you would very commonly see. An absolutely fit marathoner having a Child-Pugh B is not a combination that you would commonly see in the clinic, but you have to be very cognizant of that. And that's why, even if you're using nivolumab based on the CheckMate 4.0 cohort of B7, B8 patients, again, 10% have responses. And we all know that if you want to get on to that so-called tail of the curve, you have to have responses. So there's a 90% chance that you're going to fail therapy. So, you're going to offer it because you want to offer it, not because you really think that it's going to make a big difference in your patient. So it's most of the time a desperate situation rather than out of choice. I think I totally agree with Dr. Sahej.
We have very less time. We're running past 8. So, Dr. Pankaj, quickly, your honest opinion on this as well. What percentage of your patient actually receive second-line therapy, and how do you proceed for those second-line therapy if we have used the most common lenvatinib in your first line? Dr. Pankaj. I think Pankaj is
sorry, just a minute, sir.
So what percentage if the patient actually received second-line therapy post lenvatinib, and how do you choose that second-line therapy in your practice?
I think, sir, around 25 to 30% of the patients will be, around 25% of the patients will be still, you can say, not bad enough, who can be offered a second-line therapy. So actually, though one drug is not same like the lenvatinib or sorafenib, it has a difference, and nivolumab and the other drug pembrolizumab is different. But when we have so many of drugs, you tend to think in terms of a class of drugs. So if you have drug, use this lenvatinib or sorafenib, then you tend to use the other class of drug. Most of the times I go for the PD-L1 inhibitors. So there are other options also. You can use regorafenib, you can use cabozantinib. But practically speaking, and with the experience we have, more confident on using the PD-L1 inhibitors, though cabozantinib can also be used. And if the patient has been offered this PD-L1 inhibitor somehow not fit for TKI, nivolumab, then I don't think patient will be fit for any other drug after the patient has progressed to nivolumab. So most of the times in first line, the TKI has been offered to most of the patients. In second line, either we go with the PD-L1 inhibitors, or we tend to offer this regorafenib or cabozantinib, but these are not very easy drugs to handle.
So Dr. Senthil, very quick answer from you as well. So after lenvatinib, so Pankaj said that 20 to 25% of the patient receive second line. I say whatever percentages and whatever the patient has. So it all again depends upon. So the buck stops again at Child-Pugh. The buck stops again at the performance status. So if the patient still maintains that good Child-Pugh status and the liver function, so you showed your data on nivolumab and pembrolizumab, not very impressive data in second line. And recently there was a withdrawal of nivolumab in hepatocellular. There was talk about that withdrawal of nivolumab. So regorafenib, cabozantinib, and ramucirumab. Quickly saying that ramucirumab is for those high AFP secretors, more than 400. That is a predictive marker of response. So choosing, how do you choose that regorafenib or cabozantinib, which is now available through ITAS? So your comments.
I don't know whether cabozantinib is available, Ankur. At least I'm not aware. But let's say if it is regorafenib, I would prefer not to use regorafenib because it is another sorafenib, right? So, and as you rightly pointed out, patients in the resource study were all patients who had tolerated sorafenib well and then went on to receive regorafenib. These were not the kind of patients that you and me would see. So, regorafenib is another, terrible drug. Sorry to say so if I'm offending somebody, but that's the way it is. So again, that's what I do. If somebody has to go on regorafenib, 1 tablet, 2 tablet, and then pack up, and more than 90% would pack up very soon. So that's my experience.
So that phase 3 resource trial actually talk about the sorafenib regorafenib relay and the sorafenib around relay. So they said that when sorafenib followed by regorafenib, it actually gave a good.
Some 20 to 23 months is what they
26 months.
26 months, correct.
As compared to 19.2. So it's, I would say, very harsh of saying that once you have used sorafenib, you cannot use regorafenib. But yes, your honesty and your reality saying that patients do not tolerate this regorafenib. Even in colon cancer, we have failed badly in starting the right dosage, the escalating dosage of 2, 3, and then proceeding on to the full dosage. So what about your comments on the checkpoint inhibitors, the nivolumab and pembrolizumab, or even atezo-bev at this point of time when they maintain their childhood status?
So the question that I will ask myself is, if they were they are good enough to go on atezo-bev, why didn't I use it in the first line? So that's my first question would be. So for whatever reason, for the sake of discussion, let's say that you used lenvatinib and then they progressed. Would you want to use atezo-bev? The answer is yes, though there is no data to use that. What happens with an anti-VEGF antibody after using an anti-VEGF, multi-kinase TKI is something that we don't know. But since single agent immune checkpoint inhibitors have not done that very well in the second line, you could either use an anti-VEGF plus BEV, because there's, at least there's first line large volume data, or if you are, brave enough, leave the I am brave and then go on to using a combination of, immune checkpoint inhibitors in that kind of a situation, because you get a 30% response and at least based on the phase 1/2, a 22% overall survival. So single agent immune checkpoint inhibitor is not very attractive, but as Pankaj said, we all do that.
It's very rightly said. We have to be brave enough at the right point of time to use this combination, maybe first line or second line where we don't have the data. So I would just like to conclude. I think 1 hour is too less to discuss all these drugs in detail. So I would just like to conclude that single agent IO drugs may have a modest activity. So in time of combination, either combining VEGF with IO or TKI with IO, but we are in a need of a very strong biomarkers to predict the benefit of these agents, maybe in first line or a second line in the form of alpha fetoprotein, the pathology. So, but with so many options available, the important question is, how do we sequence them? What is the right sequence? And in all the cancers, in all solid cancers, we're talking about these sequencing only. I think SCC is going to be a very exciting field in coming 5-10 years, where medical oncologists, hepatologists, and the gastroenterologists will share, and together with the intervention radiologists will share that stage, and we will have 3-4 years of OS survival for these patients in time to come, when we had only sorafenib and now we had plethora of agent at least to talk about, and we will get those experience later in our life, and we are practicing next 5-10 years.
So Ankur, I was just thinking, as you're talking about so many options and what our panelists have been saying today, I was just thinking, chronic liver disease, they say it's poverty above and plenty below. And for therapies in hepatocellular carcinoma, I think it's poverty in the midst of plenty. So
Yes.
that's what comes to my mind when you talk about these therapies.
Sitting at 8:10, it's a dinner time for many of us. Over to Shefali.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ankur. Wonderful presentation, wonderful moderation and panel as usual. So can you take up a few questions which are there in the chat box?
I have answered most of them, Dr. Shefali. So
okay, sir. Yeah, I can see now. Wonderful, sir. So I think all of the questions you have answered.
Most.
So I thank you all. Yeah, I thank you all for your time contribution, for a wonderful academic feast, and thank you all the participants also.
Thank you.
Thank you so
thank
much.
you so much. Nice panel,
Thank
Ankur.
you.
Enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ankur, especially Dr. Sahaj, Dr. Pankaj, Dr. Senthil. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.